right now. Wonderful. So welcome in everybody. This is our third webinar in the Collaboratives Community Session Series all around messaging. And we are so excited to have two incredible guest speakers today looking at two sides of the messaging coin. I think for everyone who has ever worked on messaging, you know that one side is really important, that it should feel true to you, who you are as an organization, the work you're doing in the world. And the flip side of that is how can you really message test it against what your ideal audience is looking to see and hear and learn about, what is going to convince them to join. And I really view that as an art and a science, right? You need some amount of flavor and flair, and you need some amount of proof that it's actually going to hit what you want it to hit. And so today, I think we're really excited to be able to show both sides of that coin. We have Travis Malone from Brunswick Group talking about some of the research that happened through support from the Gates Foundation, and Adriana will introduce him in a moment. That will really give more of that science. What do high capacity donors, what are they looking for when they're thinking about collaboratives? And then Ankita will share on the flip side of that, what are collaboratives themselves really seeing around their work that is so powerful, and what are those key messages? So we'll have about 40 minutes of time looking at both sides of that coin. Then we'll stop the record button, and the remainder of our time together will be for Q&A for all of you, and it'll be off record so that you can ask any questions that you want and feel really comfortable doing so. So I will turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Adriana Garcia from the Gates Foundation. We've been working incredibly close together on all of this work, and she's going to introduce more around the Gates strategy and Travis's work.
Thank you, Isis, and thank you all for joining us today. As Isis said, my name is Adriana Garcia, and I'm a program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I'm part of the Philanthropic Partnerships team. I'll be using PPT for short because it's a long name. For those not familiar, we're a cross-cutting team at the foundation that focuses on supporting the philanthropic sector through various levers. Those are funding, research, convenings, and others. Within that team, Jennifer Stout, our deputy director, and I are focused on the tools and mechanisms that will help advance giving generally and advance giving to equity. And currently, Jen and I are focused on supporting the infrastructure of collaborative philanthropy or collaborative funds, which is what we're talking about here. And we are so proud to partner with the Philanthropy Together team on this effort. And this webinar series is one of the many ways in which we are working together to support the infrastructure of collaborative funds. And a little background as to how we got here. In 2017, our team found that despite their commitment to give, ultra-wealthy American families gave just 1.2% of their assets to charity to help them group with support from the Gates Foundation, explored the obstacles to giving, and offered 4 pathways that could potentially double the flow of funding to organizations on the ground. Collaborative philanthropy was actually identified as pathway number 1 in this research, and this was the genesis for the strategy that Jen and I are carrying out now. I invite you to dive into this research for more details, and I will share the link shortly right after I pass it over to Travis. But we understood from this research that collaborative fund models work, but we needed to bring our target population along as well and to help them better understand the opportunity in collaborative funds. We needed to do some work. We knew that in order to move more of these high capacity, ultra wealthy families in this direction, that we'd have to figure out the right messaging, especially given how challenging it can be to explain the model itself, as many of you know. This is where we brought in Brunswick, a communications firm, to do message testing and to better understand how donors understood and felt about collaborative funds in that point in time. So without any further delay, I want to hand it over to our partner on this work, Travis Malone from Brunswick, to go over these research findings. And we hope these findings will be useful to you and look forward to hearing your reflections based on your own experiences after hearing from both Travis and Ankita. Thank you so much. Travis, over to you.
Thanks, Adriana. I really appreciate you all tuning in today and giving me the opportunity to share this research. We started this last year. as Adriana said, in an effort to help fine-tune messaging in order to bring people to collaborative funds and increase interest amongst donors in participating in this giving approach. It's important to note that there's actually two phases of this research, but today's discussion is really going to focus on phase two. So we started this with conversations with ultra high net wealth individuals, their staff, collaborative staff as well as fund managers to get their perceptions of collaborative funds and understand some of the potential misunderstandings and barriers to collaborative giving that they've heard on their side. From there, we took those lessons and learnings and adapted messaging that we tested here in phase two to further refine and enhance the language that we're using to bring people into collaborative giving spaces. You'll see on the side that while this is a research that was specific to the United States, this is also a proxy audience for ultra high net wealth individuals. Obviously, it's hard to find the billionaires to take a survey, but we found in other research that this is a credible audience and does represent the general opinions and beliefs of the ultra high net wealth individuals as well. So to kick things off, it's important to note that we're not starting from scratch here. And in fact, most of the net high wealth individuals that are familiar with collaboratives are actually familiar with collaboratives here. So you'll see that 61% are somewhat or very familiar. And that's very important to know. But you'll also see that there's room to improve that awareness and understanding. And that's really evident here on the next slide, where we see at the top, these are statements that really focus on the intent behind collaborative funds, what they're meant to do, how they involve multiple donors. But when we look at some false statements, some red herring statements about the how and the what of collaborative funds, we see that there is a large amount of donors who do have some misperceptions and lack of understanding of how collaborative funds operate. So we need to educate them. And with anything, it's clear that the more you know, the better. And that holds true with any giving vehicle as well. Most are familiar and favorable towards collaboratives. But as more people are familiar and understand them, the more favorable they are. That is, of course, a no-brainer, but it's important to know that we have to continue to speak to these messages. We have to continue to educate our potential donors on the value of collaborative funds to bring them to the table. And the great news is there is significant interest in this. So 75% of our audience was very interested in learning more about collaboratives. And that holds true across asset levels and generation. It's led by millennials. So the real question is, it's not, is there interest? It's how do we bring them to the table? How do we turn that interest into action? How do we make sure that those future ultra high net wealth individuals are going to use collaborative funds in their giving approaches down the road? And it really starts with speaking to their interests. And it's funny, Isis stole the show with her exercise in the beginning. You already know this. You already described your collaborative funds as such. It's really focusing on the knowledge sharing, the building community with an emphasis on the community leaders, the issue experts that are collaborating and learning together alongside those donors. And it's also speaking to the efficiency of collaborative giving and collaborative funds, showing that they don't need a full foundation to invest in the issues that they care most about. Looking at those will be the most. You need to lead with these. But obviously, there are other things about your collaborative funds that you want to speak to, and you should. But when it comes to where do you start, it starts with community and it starts with efficiency. And of course, everybody's eyes turn to the red at the bottom. We'll get there in a second. But I want to know that equity is a clear focus of a lot of collaborative funds, and we're not suggesting you shouldn't speak to it, but we'll tell you how to do so here in a bit. So as I said earlier, we really did want to focus this phase two on the messaging itself. And Isis will share an infographic that kind of shows the best ways of describing collaborative funds based off of our research. But we're going to share some simple tips and tricks on how to do it your way, but just do it a little bit better, maybe a little bit more efficiently, so to speak. So the first is, again, to really emphasize that collaboration and working together. Again, really underscoring the fact that it's a community learning experience with community leaders, issue experts, and fellow givers all in one room, all in one avenues or space, learning and growing together and accomplishing a mission. Accelerating the impact and using that flexibility to meet a variety of needs. Those are what really stood out when we were showing various messages in both phase 1 and phase 2. So that's clear things that we need to focus on, and regardless of what your collaborative fund does or how long it's existed, really focusing on those core elements. And then on the right side, it's really things that you should consider, but you know best your own organizations and your own needs. But one thing that we saw is that any examples of success are really great in explaining the how and the what. As you saw on an earlier slide, people have a general idea of the intention of collaborative funds and collaborative giving overall. But examples of how yours operate, because they don't all operate in the same way, it might be different, are really critical in understanding or getting donors to understand how yours operates. And then avoiding terminology that might be high level, so to speak. As Mark Twain and my grandma once said, why use a $5 word when a 50-cent word will do? I want to say my grandma probably did it first. But that really is true, is that we in this level of philanthropy might have common phrases that we think are common outside of our circle, outside of our bubble. That is not the case. We have to be intentional about speaking plainly and simply about what our mission is and how we get there. And then finally, you saw on the previous slide that equity and diverse leadership was one of the less performing messages. That's not to say that we shouldn't reference it. In fact, if it's a critical part of your collaborative fund, you should message around it. But it's also clear that, there is some DEI fatigue. It's in the news. It's clear as day. So just being strategic about when and how you use it. You know your audience best. If it is a core foundation of what you do, don't wait to speak up about it, but understanding that it might not resonate with every high net wealth individual as well. And when we shared our narrative, what we found is that 88% of those high net wealth individuals actually found a positive reaction to the messaging. And that small 12% that were negative and neutral really did speak to the equity piece. But that's 88% of potential donors who resonated with this, who appreciated the opportunities of collaborative giving and collaborative funds and understand the impact that it can have with their assets and in their communities. And here are just some verbatims from the research that kind of speaks to themselves. One donor said, people with a shared vision of philanthropy, combining resources and experience to accomplish a charitable goal, they like that focus, and also on the issues themselves. And some people, again, do appreciate the focus on equity. So it's not to say that you shouldn't focus on that. We're really speaking to the consolidation of power, direct giving approaches, and then, of course, the efficiency, the expectations of impact and results, and the reduction of overhead. So these are things that they took out from it, and we want to emphasize in our communication. And when we do so, we see an increase in interest and favorability. And most importantly, we also see an increase in the interest in allocating collaboratives going forward. And this is what we want to see the most of. After exposure, we see that it is the second largest giving vehicle that people would use, potential donors would use in their giving approaches. So the more consistently we can take these steps in communicating about our funds, your funds, the better. So I'll pass it to Isis to talk about the other side, the art of it, so to speak, and I would love to hear your questions afterwards.
Thank you so much, Travis. Wonderful research, and you went through that so quickly. So I hope everyone was really able to understand and grok some of what you were sharing. I think for me, what really resonated for me is that the sort of 75% of people want to know more about collaboratives. And when they do, and they learn actually about what this model does and is, their favorability goes up. And as their favorability goes up, hopefully they will actually change and move their dollars more in that direction. So I think that's all what we're trying to do. So the challenges of what you shared is also really key, and I think we'll get to this in the discussion, but on the question of equity, right? We're not saying here that this messaging is something that means that we should kowtow to donors and only do what they want to hear, right? When we all know that messages of equity are so crucial, and that's the work that so many of you are doing. So what is that balance for us to be able to message appropriately and be able to bring people along, but not sort of lessen the work and lessen what you all are doing on the other side? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ankita Patel. Maybe Travis, if you can stop your screen share. So with Ankita, we've had the great pleasure of working with Panorama Global for the last year or so. They were deeply involved also with the Collaborative Summit. For those of you who were there, we led a few sessions there called collabs, and collabs was a way for us to really go deep in workshop style with everyone at the summit to co-create something real. And Ankita and her team at Panorama led one of those collabs all around messaging from the perspective of collaboratives themselves. And over the course of 2 hours, we did the sessions twice. More than 100 different folks came through that session and were able to really give their ideas and input and feedback into what is the strongest messaging around the value of collaborative. So I'm so excited to welcome Ankita here, who will walk through those 10 messaging points.
Thank you, Isis, and hello, everyone. My name is Ankita Patel. I'm the Director of Social Impact here at Panorama Global. I live on the unceded territories of the Duwamish people, otherwise known as Seattle, Washington. Just a little bit about myself. Prior to Panorama, I worked at a statewide domestic violence coalition where I managed state and federal grants for victim service providers that were engaged in advocacy and policy efforts. So I've had experience in really managing restricted grants before I entered the philanthropic space, where I launched, managed, and led evaluation efforts of a donor collaborative that was focused on ensuring a complete and accurate census count here in Washington during the 2020 census. So those were just like a couple of experiences that led me to Panorama. Panorama Global is a social impact nonprofit that empowers change makers through radical collaboration. We have managed and fiscally sponsored collaborative funds. And out of the collaborative funds we've distributed nearly $27 million in grants across 6 collaborative funds. My colleague over here, Jen Cho, is participating as in the audience, but she can share more about her collaborative funds work in the chat if anyone is interested. And then for more information about Panorama and our impact, I'm just going to drop a link in the chat in case you're interested in learning more about our other efforts. So more specifically, Panorama Global has engaged over 200 nonprofit executives and leaders through our Collaborative Learning for Impact Philanthropy, CLIP for short, to really understand the impact of Mackenzie Scott's unrestricted giving. We've designed and facilitated peer learning communities with the goal to understand, assess, and leverage learnings on the impact of unrestricted grants in the social impact space globally. We have convened 6 cohorts, including 2 global development cohorts, racial and gender justice-oriented organizations, philanthropy-serving organizations, and relevant to this group, collaborative funds. So in the lead up to the global summit that Isis was referring to, we convened the Collaborative Funds Learning Community, and they shared their insights about the benefit of collaborative funds to donors and to grassroots and community-based organizations. For donors, collaborative funds can be a one-stop shop to engage in the issues that they care about. And they have to avoid having to build or rebuild or build an infrastructure to invest and shorten their own learning curve in terms of where to invest to maximize their impact. The learning community also shared about the benefit to community-based organizations. Collaborative funds are able to reach historically excluded communities, provide support beyond the check, either through capacity building, strategic support, or other services. And so if you want to learn about the Collaborative Funds Learning Community Insights, I'm also going to go ahead and include that report in the chat for you to read at your own leisure. So during the Global Summit, Jen Cho, my colleague, and I facilitated 2 sessions, like Isis was saying, with over 100 collaborative funds and funders to co-develop these key messages. We also invited a couple of our CLIP learning community participants to share case stories as a way to inspire and really engage the participants to really think about what are the key messages that they are relying on and what would the key messages that they would like to amplify to funders. And as a result of the facilitated sessions at the Global Summit, we issued an insights report distilling the messages into 10 key messages or reasons why funders should invest in collaborative funds. So this was really a crowdsourced effort, and these messages were really driven by the collaborative funds and funders in the room to talk about like what are some of the messages that you can talk to your funders or potential funders about. I'm not going to read all these messages, but I wanted to really talk about the range of the messages. Some of the messages are around how funders can contribute to large-scale and sustainable change, especially given the complexity of issues and the levels of investments needed to tackle those issues. Funders can also be part of a community of donors, community leaders, and experts to engage in learning and strategic thinking. Collaborative funds provide an infrastructure to distribute funds and resources, reducing the burden on donors themselves. Finally, collaborative funds also support nonprofit leaders in their overhead and fundraising efforts by doing the work of pooling the resources and reducing varying expectations across funders, giving nonprofits and grassroots organizations more time and ability to focus on delivering their services. So those were some of the range of messages that you'll see in our report. For a little bit more of context on the discussion that took place when we were crowdsourcing these messages in terms of cultivating donors and working with existing one, not every message will resonate with every donor. I think Travis also pointed to that in his presentation. Collaborative funds talked about the importance of cultivating relationships with their donors, engaging them in learning or understanding their short-term and long-term strategies, and understanding their interests. For instance, you'll see in the report that not all donors might engage uniformly. For some, they might want to be a silent partner, whereas others may want to really engage in really understanding and learning like the depth of the issue or the communities that they would like to fund. Another point of consideration is where donors are in their philanthropic journey. Some may not understand how to access and fund within the social sector, like Travis was referring to as well, whereas others may hold a very nuanced view on the importance of intersectional, multi-year gen-op funding, all the jargons in the world, like they might get it. So it's really important to consider where your donors are or potential donors are in their philanthropic journey and how you might consider tailoring your messages depending on their skills and experience. Finally, there's a lot of conversation within the philanthropic and the nonprofit sector around how are we tailoring our fundraising to meet the needs of the donor and whether we should be tailoring our messages to fit the needs of the donor. So I think that there have been positive signs of more donors needing to really focus on centering community interests and need. And that's a delicate balance in terms of how do you get donors to really think about what is their interest and how do they really think about aligning it to community interests. Collaborative funds sit at the center of being both recipient of funds as well as grant making within the social impact sector. We learned from our learning community participants and from the session that there's a real opportunity for collaborative funds to co-create with existing and new donors to engage and fund in a manner that promotes a relational and equitable mechanism of giving. So with that, I'll pause here, and I just wanted to share a few of the reflections and the journey that Panorama has been engaged in terms of learning and understanding the impact of unrestricted and large-scale giving, especially in the collaborative fund space. And I know, Travis, you and I may debate on the finer points, and I'm looking forward to more nuanced questions so that we can unpack those with folks here today.
Thank you so much, Ankita. And I really hope I encourage everyone to click that last link that she shared in the chat. That has the very clear 10 messages that were part of the Collaborative Summit findings and turned into this really key distilled report. I also wanted to share from our end some work we've been doing to sort of how do we bridge the gap of all of this terminology. So I'm going to quickly share something on the other end. This is not research. It's not from the field itself. It's trying to then turn that into something out there in the world. And we've sort of had good success in learning from doing this with a bunch of philanthropic advisors and donors. And the first thing that I want to point out here is that we've been saying collaborative funds, collaboratives, right, in both what Ankita shared and what Travis shared. And I know that many of you coming into this space and coming into collaborative funds are also calling yourself intermediaries or donor collaboratives or pooled funds or aligned funds or regranters. All of those terms and languages is totally fine. You all should continue doing whatever it is that feels most relevant to the work that you're putting out in the world. I think what we're hoping to do by really focusing on collaboratives overall is how to set a broader container for donors and folks in this space so that this doesn't feel like you're doing this, I'm doing this, and they are totally separate, but it's more telling a larger, bolder, bigger story about a new class of giving that is happening that donors can really get involved in. And so I hope this framing might help some of you that even if your current website or messaging only, let's say, uses donor collaboratives, maybe somewhere on your website, you might also want to say collaborative fund. Or if you're only using intermediary, you might want to add collaborative fund to help be part of that broader sort of SEO work that happens on the internet and through AI these days, right? To sort of situate yourself in this broader field. I think the other reason we've seen through the Travis research as well and in talking to real funds is that some of the terms like intermediaries and regranters position the work that you all are doing as purely a middle money flowing situation. And we all know that that is not what you do. You do so much beyond that. And so how can we elevate and support and lift up that work? The other thing that we've sort of helped also distill out like the three main facets of this is it's usually around pooled resources. It's usually around this multi-level collaboration, both between donors and groups on the ground and you all in that middle role. And it's about that scaled systems impact. And then this was an insight that came out of the Collaborative Summit as well, that collaborative funds sit in that messy middle and are able to perform alchemy. They're both a grant maker and a grant seeker. They both are sort of teachers and listeners, right? They're translators and community builders. So they're acting on both ends of the coin. And that is really the value add that collaboratives are able to offer. And ultimately, we're sort of terming this as an entirely different class of giving so that this doesn't just feel like some small new shift, but really a new way that folks can consider giving and doing this work. So wanted to share some of that in case that was helpful as well in terms of distillation. And now I would love to bring Ankita and Travis to the stage and Adriana as well. And we will spend the rest of our time taking some questions from the group. And I'm going to turn off the recording as well.
I'm just